What you're about to see is probably the best looking 8-bit NES and Commodore 64 platformer of all time. Sam's journey is so well made, it shouldn't be possible on the Commodore 64, and some aspects of it definitely defy what we know about the NES hardware as well. Yet here we are. It plays perfectly on original, unmodified hardware on both the NES and the Commodore 64. Developed by Knights of Bytes, an exceptionally talented group of Commodore 64 developers, from the 90s, Sam's Journey first released at the end of 2017 for the Commodore 64 and in 2024 on the NES. Now guys, in this video we're going to take a look at both the NES and the Commodore 64 versions, and I will explain the differences between the two in great detail. I will be showing footage of both versions interchangeably, so if you're not familiar with the Commodore 64, here's how to differentiate them. This right here is the original Commodore 64 version. As you can see, other than the distinctive Commodore 64 sound and colors, you can tell it's the C64 version by the UI that is ever present at the bottom of the screen during levels. This is the NES version. It takes up more of the screen and it doesn't have the ever-present UI. When Sam's Journey first released on the Commodore 64 back in 2017, it was unlike anything we had seen previously on the computer. To say that the game pushes the Commodore 64 to its limits would be an understatement. Even to this day, no platformer or action game has reached the scope or visual fidelity of Sam's Journey on the Commodore 64, much less its highly polished gameplay mechanics. So, the game features a fully realized world map, not unlike Super Mario World, Super Mario 3 and so on. It has 3 different worlds or zones, exceptionally detailed and artistically stunning visuals, 8-way scrolling, which is a huge undertaking for any Commodore 64 game. Now guys, to add to this already stunning package, Sam's Journey has both sound and music. Now this might not sound like anything special to you, but on the Commodore 64, most games would only have either sound effects or music. They couldn't do both at the same time. So coupled with the incredible visuals and the huge scope of the game, to have both sound and music playing at the same time is just an incredible achievement on the C64. And now it's time to properly review Sam's Journey. Sam's Journey is a simple, straightforward platformer where the player controls Sam as he makes his way through a fantasy world. That's a pretty simple premise, right? Similar to Kirby and Kid Chameleon, Sam gains different abilities depending on which costumes or suits he finds throughout the game and equips. Sam's Journey starts off as a linear platformer, with some light puzzle elements here and there, but as the player progresses through the adventure, the puzzles become more and more intricate and complex. Now, while they never really reach progress-halting levels of complexity and difficulty, fortunately for me because I don't like puzzles, the once rather, I would say, straightforward nature of Sam's Journey does start to lean more into puzzle platformer territory in some sections of the game. The puzzles in Sam's Journey often involve a combination of bounce springs so that the player can reach higher ground, and the use of switches in order to make blocks appear or disappear, granting Sam access to new areas in the levels. This often leads to keys, which the player has to bring to optional or mandatory locked doors. Now, often there are many ways to tackle these puzzles in each of the levels, and that can depend on the costumes the game has laid out for the player in the level or the costumes Sam already has equipped. But guys, one thing is for certain, and this is very important to understand. You can never hit game-breaking glitches when solving these puzzles, meaning that Sam will never be stuck in impossible situations, which in the past could happen on some Commodore 64 games. The different costumes, as well as the superb and clean controls and phenomenal physics, which is not common for the Commodore 64, make traversing the wonderful, amazingly crafted levels a true joy. Sam's journey rivals the best of the best 8 and 16-bit platformers, and this is very important to understand because we're talking about a game that released on the Commodore 64, a severely limited system. It's very clear that a lot of talent, time, and thought went into designing the movement and collisions in this one. There are some collision issues here and there, but they're few and far between, and nothing to even remotely consider an actual negative against the game or an issue, so just don't worry about that, forget they even exist. Sam, throughout his journey, equips and finds different costumes that give him different abilities. So now let's take a more detailed look at these costumes. First up is Pirate Sam. This costume lets the player attack enemies with a pirate cutlass. In fact, it's the only costume in the entire game that offers melee combat. The ninja costume gives Sam the ability to cling to walls and slowly move downwards as needed, as well as wall jump from one wall to another. Now, the controls for this costume are different between the C64 and NES due to the fact that on the C64, joysticks and controllers have only one functional button by default. Up on the joystick or D-pad on the Commodore 64 functions as both an upward movement for letters and letter-like objects, as well as jump as it does in other Commodore 64 games. On the other hand, we have the NES, which has two functional action buttons and a more traditional control scheme. This unfortunately affects the ninja costume the most, so C64 players will have to take some time to get used to the wall jumping mechanics at first. Sam's third costume is Disco Sam. What's interesting about this costume is that it has two functions. One, it lets Sam glide through the air and slowly descend while spinning, and the other one, an exceptionally important one actually, is that while spinning, if Sam lands on an enemy, he instantly kills the ones that take more than one hit to defeat with all other costumes. This costume is also exceptionally useful against these mummy enemies the game has, which can only be knocked down but never killed with the other costumes. The game will often generously give this costume to the player either on the main path or in less obvious but still very accessible spots in areas where these mummies are usually present, because otherwise you can't kill them and they have a pretty darn nasty mid-ranged attack. Sam's fourth costume, that you actually find very early on, is Sam's astronaut costume. This one gives him a very nice double jump ability that lets the player reach new optional areas very early in the game. Now comes the least useful costume in the game, and that would be Sam's pitcher costume. You see, Sam can pick up and throw items at enemies such as rocks or chests, or when he doesn't have his pirate costume to break open chests with, he has to open them by throwing them at enemies, or he has to throw rocks at the chest in order to open them. This is where Sam's fifth costume comes into play, and that is Pitcher Sam. When equipped, Sam is able to aim by using a moving reticle similar to that of Yoshi in the Yoshi's Island games. This is all well made and well executed, however, it is not often used in the game. So technically this costume is actually pretty useless. I can only think of a few occasions where I had to use it. Otherwise, it's a very useless costume, and I don't think it has any other abilities other than this one. Now, the sixth and most powerful costume would be Sam's vampire outfit. This is sometimes given to the player on the main path, but more often than not, it is secluded in secret areas. With the vampire costume, Sam has a limited power of flight by turning into a bat. However, as soon as the flight power expires or times out, or Sam touches ground, he turns back into a human. Collecting crystals while in bat form extends the duration of Sam's flight ability. In fact, in one level, there is an entire section where Sam has to turn into a bat, collect crystals on time, while navigating a simple spike-ridden obstacle course. The vampire costume can be used to slowly descend, similar to what Disco Sam can actually do. However, it offers no extra attack power. This is the most important and useful costume when it comes to level exploration, discovering secrets, or breaking sequence, and realizing that the genius developers over at Knights of Bytes took everything into consideration, and I mean everything, and that when you think you're breaking sequence, you are actually not. You're merely taking a different approach to exploring and traversing the levels. The vampire costume shows just how carefully handcrafted the levels of Sam's journey are. How much time and effort was put into designing each and every level so it has something to offer for each possible costume. You're not breaking any sequences, you're merely taking different paths that the developers had accounted for. It's important to understand that the levels are designed around the use of the different costumes, and the costumes are designed around the levels themselves. This is absolutely incredible. Sam's journey is an astounding display of game design done right. Everything fits together so perfectly. Costumes are very carefully laid out throughout the creatively designed levels so that the player can always wear the right costume for the opportunity and for the area they find themselves in. However, Sam's journey is full of secrets. The levels are actually pretty big and masterfully interconnected, and sometimes it's a wise decision not to pick up the costumes the developers had laid out for you, but rather to try and preserve other costumes that you are already wearing that will help you access certain areas or secrets in the game. While going through the majority of the levels and sticking to the costumes that the game offers isn't overly difficult, the real challenge comes when the player has to preserve their favorite costume or the costumes that they need to access certain areas of a level. The reason behind this is because one hit from an enemy or an enemy projectile and you lose that costume. Another hit and Sam is dead and back to the checkpoint. You guys have to understand that in this game there will be no shortage of you finding all sorts of creative and dumb ways for you to lose your costumes and to lose your lives. And it won't be the game's fault either. The developers accounted for all this, so they offer a return to checkpoint option in the pause menu, which is going to take you back, or rather reset your progress, to the last activated checkpoint. Now, speaking of the checkpoints, the game has an entire gameplay mechanic and system built around use of checkpoints to give the player a chance to both explore the levels and preserve costumes as needed. And this is very important to understand, so we're going to take a look at the system now. Checkpoints are in the form of flags. When they are inactive, the flag is red. As soon as Sam touches the checkpoint, the flag turns green and activates, meaning that upon death, or if the player chooses to restart from the last activated checkpoint, this is where they will respawn. Juggling active checkpoints and knowing when to activate new ones or when to go back and reactivate nearby old checkpoints is key to level exploration and preservation of your favorite costumes. And as long as you don't activate a new inactive checkpoint by accident, all your progress you've made in that area, both good and bad, will be reset upon restarting from the last active checkpoint. Once you've familiarized yourself with the area and the chest content, decided which enemies need to be eliminated and which ones need to be kept so that you can use them to open chests with, you can, if you want or need to, restart from the last checkpoint. Clear the area again as needed and then activate a new checkpoint in order to save your progress in that area. You can either, of course, go back to a previously seen inactive nearby checkpoint or activate a brand new one if you've come close to one. This was, I believe, deliberately designed so that the player can tackle dangerous areas carefully while preserving their costumes as needed. So guys, juggling checkpoints takes some time and can be a tad annoying at times, but it's worth it, because you ensure that your favorite costumes are equipped throughout the entire level and can be taken to another level if needed. Sam's Journey may not be a Metroidvania, but its levels are big enough and rich enough with secrets for it to resemble one. That's why understanding the costume and checkpoint system is of utmost importance, so that you can get the most out of each level, collect as much loot as you can, and if you're able, 100% the levels. Knights of Bytes decided to do away with annoying tropes such as limited number of lives or steep timers. In fact, there is no timer or any kind of lives in the game. They give you completely unlimited lives. So players, by utilizing the checkpoint system, can explore or practice more difficult portions of the game at their leisure. None of this would have been as enjoyable or as seamless to pull off if Sam's Journey didn't have phenomenal controls both on the C64 and on the NES. From the excellent and amazing jump and bounce mechanics to the clean and very well done movement mechanics, the game makes traversing levels an absolute joy, as I already said. Sam's Journey excels in the gameplay department. But, as you can see, the game also has absolutely incredible, unbelievable visuals on both the Commodore 64 and the NES. You have to understand that the Commodore 64 has only 16 colors in its palette, yet through masterful and ingenious combination of these 16 colors and deep understanding of the Commodore 64 hardware limitations, Knights of Bytes managed to create a game so visually advanced that back in the 80s or even the 90s would be deemed impossible on the Commodore 64, yet it all runs so perfectly smoothly on original unmodified hardware. Now, they did have to produce a larger than normal cartridge so that the game could get a physical release on cartridge, but it still works perfectly fine on unmodified original hardware. Sam's Journey has a variety of different locations, each with their own distinct feel, atmosphere, from forests to lush green areas, deserts, all kinds of underwater environments. I don't know, man, the game has it all. It's just incredible, especially on the Commodore 64, where such level variety was almost unheard of. When it comes to art direction, there are pretty obvious differences between the NES and the Commodore 64. On the Commodore 64, the developers decided to use more vibrant and less natural colors for some of the tiles, which gives the game a more magical and whimsical look. In the Commodore 64 version also, the sky is often a gradient of green, purple, red and blue, whereas in the NES version, in the same levels, the sky has a more grounded orange tone to it. Now, this is up to your personal preference, but I feel that the Commodore 64 version in some of these levels looks a lot more whimsical and outworldly. Another aspect of the Commodore 64 version that I prefer is that often purple, green and blue tones are used for shading of the tiles, whereas on the NES, which has a much larger pool of colors to choose from, the developers went with a more grounded art direction and their shading is much more similar to what the base color of the tiles is. Sure, the NES version has higher resolution and increased field of view. However, It also has drastic changes in art direction compared to the Commodore 64 original, for better or for worse. And I don't know if this was done on purpose or if it is due to limitations of the NES hardware and how colors can be used and which colors can be used next to each other, because they also got rid of the blue and purple shading that is present throughout the Commodore 64 version. Now, I personally think that both games look absolutely astounding. However, in some levels, I definitely prefer the art direction that was taken on the Commodore 64. But in some levels, I feel that the game looks better on the NES. Regardless of which version you choose to play, you are going to get a wonderful looking game. So don't worry about this. It's only up to your own personal preference. Had I never played the Commodore 64 game, I would have been just as blown away by the NES version as I was originally by the Commodore 64 one. It's absolutely mind-blowing to me how creative the developers were when it comes to faking water transparency in both versions of Sam's Journey by simply changing the palette of background objects at just the right points so that they look like they're partially underwater. This is absolutely phenomenal. And you would say that water transparency shouldn't be possible on the NES, much less on the Commodore 64, and you would be right, but they found a very clever and very creative trick to achieve this without actually going for real transparency or having to use some kind of blending layers. Now, although the visuals make Sam's Journey a stunningly unique experience to behold, on both the NES and especially the C64, that's not the main reason it stood out when it came out first for the Commodore 64. In fact, we had games with excellent, fantastic graphics as far as back in the 90s. To understand just why Sam's Journey is so unique and so well made, it's way above other C64 games of its kind, I will take a little bit of a detour and I will talk a little bit about the history the Commodore 64 has with action games and platformers. So I'm sure many of you have heard the term Euro platformer, Euro shmup, and it's often used as a derogatory and negative term. So we're going to take a look at why that is in this portion of the video. So, while back in the day the NES was no stranger to incredible action games, all kinds of amazing platformers, phenomenal hardware-defying visuals, and all kinds of amazing gameplay mechanics, the Commodore 64, as capable as it was, could only really excel in the graphics and sound department, specifically the music, which is what made Commodore 64 games so atmospheric and unique. While perfectly capable of actually producing great action games and platformers, the best the system had to offer at the time were the Turrican games, Giana Sisters, Hard and Heavy, and one of the CJ games, as well as a few other games that actually weren't overly tedious to play. But unfortunately, many of its best games still employed some absurd and backwards design decisions that even for their time were dated. Now guys, this is going to anger many Commodore 64 fans, and I take full responsibility for that. But what I'm about to say is the truth. I've already discussed how much I absolutely adored and loved the Commodore 64 in previous videos. However, that does not mean the Commodore 64 had good games. It did have fascinating and atmospheric ones, to be sure, and I don't deny that, but when it comes to more action-oriented games, what it had to offer failed every fundamental good game design checkbox. What I mean by that is, the Commodore 64 had no shortage of action games and platformers, but most of these games, including some of the best possible ones such as creatures and mayhem in Monsterland would suffer from very bad game design decisions and fundamentally broken reasoning on the developer's end of what makes a game fun or challenging. Now, with that said, the Commodore 64 was exceptionally popular here in Europe, so most of its finest and best developers were European, of course. And their design philosophy would be known throughout the years as Euro game design. And that's where the Euro platformer, Euro shmup terms come from, because these type of games would originate on these home computers. While Japanese developers would focus on streamlining but not necessarily simplifying level design, platforming mechanics, winning conditions, and so on, European developers would unfortunately stick to the same tropes that made their games tedious rather than fun. And this was a huge problem, especially to those of us who were exposed to Japanese developed games, arcade games, and so on. European designed games would often have steep requirements just to clear a level, such as collecting all pickups in the level or collecting every last one of a certain item, otherwise the level would repeat or you wouldn't be able to finish it and you'd have to backtrack throughout the level even though the level was not properly designed for backtracking. Jumping would often be severely restricted by platforms, ceilings, or walls placed right above the playable character. European designed games or Euro games would often have huge hitboxes, steep timers for exploration games. For shmups, we had absolutely awful balance between enemy and player movement speeds. Enemies would take a lot of bullets to be destroyed because they had way too much health and so on. Some people who defend this type of design and who consider it good game design to this day cite system limitations for these issues. However, I cannot agree with that because when the developers of these games moved from the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum to more powerful systems such as the Amiga, Sega Mega Drive, and so on, they carried their flawed video game design philosophy with them. So Euro games would find their way on other much more powerful platforms and still have the same flawed and broken gameplay mechanics. This, in my opinion, was a pretty sad state of affairs because home computer developers back in the 80s and 90s would often actually find inspiration in Japanese games that they played at the arcades or on home consoles. However, they would completely misunderstand the game's basic gameplay design and what it made these games so good, fun, and even challenging. Now, I'm not trying to say that the Commodore 64 had nothing but bad games. There were many excellent titles, although they were flawed partially because they were a product of their times, because of the design philosophy that European developers followed, and because more often than not, home computer developers were not really given the opportunity and time to test their games properly. However, it is a fact that European developers do tend to stick to certain tropes and certain design aspects of their games that make them very tedious and not as fun to play. And this right here is exactly what Sam's Journey refuses to be. It refuses to be a Euro platformer. Knights of Bytes clearly understand what actually makes a platformer fun, accessible, and challenging, while completely removing any and all tedium from the experience. Alright, so when it comes to sound and music, Sam's Journey sports an absolutely amazing soundtrack of 19 different tracks on the Commodore 64 and NES. And there is surprisingly very little difference between the two. Of course, the C64 version has that unique, amazing, distinctive C64 tone to it, but the NES version somehow isn't far behind, and Knights of Bytes really managed to make the game sound as close to the original C64 as possible on the NES, which to me is pretty amazing. Now, as a visual artist, I have little to nothing to say about music or sound design. I can't really comment on this stuff because I don't understand composition, I don't understand music, I don't understand music theory and so on. But I can tell you that Sam's Journey has one of the most memorable soundtracks in the past 10 years or so. Guys, I'm so glad that I was finally able to review this masterpiece of a game. Now I'm going to tell you where you can buy it, because I really want each and every one of you to give this game a chance, because it's just such a one-of-a-kind amazing experience. Now, this video is neither sponsored, nor have I ever told any of the developers or stores that I'm reviewing this. I'm just doing this on my own volition because I really want to share this game with as many people as possible. So let's take a look at where you can buy the game and where you can buy each version of the game. Now, if you want to buy a physical version of the Commodore 64 game, you are going to have to head over to Protovision's website. There you can purchase several versions of the game, including a cartridge version, which is PAL only, meaning it's only going to work properly on European Commodore 64 systems, and a disc version, which comes on several floppy drives, that also has NTSC US version as well. Now, it's important to note that if you buy any of the physical versions of this game, you're automatically going to be given the digital version, and you're going to get both the PAL and NTSC versions of the digital version of the game. The same goes for the NES version. Now, the NES version has to be bought from Polyplay's website, and there they have actually both an NTSC cartridge and a PAL version cartridge. However, upon purchasing these cartridges, you get both the PAL and NTSC version in ROM digital format, so you can play them however you want on your flash cards or what have you, or an emulation and so on. You can also buy the digital version only from each I/O of both the C64 and the NES game, and you can play them on emulators or flash cards or what have you. So yeah, guys, this was Sam's journey. It's an absolutely incredible game. I'm not gonna tell you that I hope you play this and enjoy it. I'm gonna tell you that go and play this now. You are going to love it. You are going to enjoy it. You will be blown away. Now, I suggest checking out the Commodore 64 version if you are not familiar with it already, and if you are a Commodore 64 fan from back in the day, or you can get the NES version. It really doesn't matter. Both versions are incredible. Sam's Journey is an absolute masterpiece that everybody who loves platformers, who loves beautiful whimsical games, needs to experience.